Professor Singer, your opening statement.
Thank you very much, and I want to thank you, Larry, for organising this event, for this time coming to my hometown as I still think of Melbourne, and John Lennox too for joining me here, and I'm very glad that you at least got to see a football match. Whatever else happens, you'll have learned something from this visit. And I want to thank you, John, too, of course, for your remarks and the spirit in which you've given them. So, let me begin with the reasons why I do not believe in God. I suppose you could say there is at least one positive reason why I don't believe in God and two negative reasons. The positive reason is the one that was reputed to have been uttered by Laplace when the Emperor Napoleon asked him where God figured in his account of the cosmos. And Laplace famously replied, "I had no need of that hypothesis." In other words, to Laplace, the universe was sufficiently explicable without positing a God, or at least no more explicable if we do posit one. So why do so? And that, despite some of the things that John has said in his remarks, which I will come to either later now or in rebuttal, I think is still the case. We do not need to believe in God in order to explain the universe, and belief in God does not really help us to explain it. Why do people believe in God? Well, I'm asking that as a philosophical question rather than a psychological question. There may be some psychological needs for people to believe in God, but looking at that as more as a philosophical question, we could say that in the Christian tradition, particularly in medieval times, the tradition attempted to develop rational arguments for the existence of God. And to some extent that still exists among Roman Catholic circles. I'll mention three of those famous arguments. There's the first cause argument, that you need to believe in God to answer the question, what caused the universe to exist? And the answer is, of course, God created it. John says he believes. We're talking about the biblical God, the God who is supposed to have created the world. Secondly, the ontological argument, which works from the definition of God as a being with all the perfections. And thirdly, the argument from design, that the world shows signs of having been designed by a God. Let me briefly look at these. The first cause argument is sometimes today resurrected as something that is compatible with science, because people sometimes say, haven't we learnt through science that the universe began with a Big Bang, that it began around 13 billion years ago? John, I think, said that it was created from nothing, or he quoted a scientist saying it was created from nothing. And how could that happen? How can you create something from nothing? Doesn't that suggest that there has to be a God? But I think scientists are guilty of sowing a great deal of confusion when they use the word universe in statements such as the universe began 13 billion years ago with the Big Bang. If you actually tackle a physicist who studies this issue and ask, what do you really mean by the universe in that statement? They will tell you, if they're honest, that what they're talking about is the observable universe, or the known universe. The universe that we can observe with our telescopes and all the devices we have seems to have begun from some kind of bang, if you like, development about 13 billion years ago, and to have been expanding ever since. But if you ask the scientist, well, do we know that it began from nothing? They will answer, no, we don't know that at all. We can't observe anything before the Big Bang. So any statements about what the situation was before the Big Bang are not scientific statements. They are statements perhaps of religious faith or belief. So it may well be that the universe, for example, has been constantly oscillating been constantly expanding and then collapsing and then expanding again, and it's been doing that forever, for infinite time. That's perfectly compatible with everything that science can tell us. So we don't need a God to explain the beginning of the universe. The universe may have always existed. And indeed, if we think that, as the first cause argument runs, everything has to have a first cause, then of course that argument applies to God as well. If we're allowed to say God needs no first cause, then we ought to be allowed to say the universe needs no first cause. The ontological argument, briefly stated, is that we define God as a being who has all of the perfections, all of the possible perfections. That means a God who is supremely whatever qualities you can think of as being perfect: beautiful, wise, good, powerful, and so on. But then it's claimed that if this God did not exist, that would be a failing, that would be a lack. So this perfect being would lack something, namely existence, therefore God must exist. Well, very, very few philosophers nowadays believe that argument. If it sounded to you like some kind of conjuring trick, getting the existence of God out of a mere definition, I think your instinct was right. I believe that Alvin Plantinga, who John cited a while ago, is one of the very few philosophers who thinks that that argument does have some merit, but I certainly don't. Existence is not an attribute in the same way that power or beauty or wisdom or goodness are attributes, and it's a simple confusion to think that you can define a being into existence in that way. Thirdly, the argument from design was once quite a powerful argument. It's the watchmaker's argument. Richard Dawkins has a book, The Blind Watchmaker, that says, well, you know, if things happen by evolution, how could they all fit together so well? It seems like everything works well in the universe. There are signs of things having been designed. Certainly people of the past thought that animals were created for us to eat and for us to wear their skins, and they pointed to other things in nature like the fact that if water did not expand when it froze, then ponds would freeze solid and fish would die and so on. There are things that people regarded as being beautifully designed, including our own organs and the organs of animals, which seem to have certain functions and purposes. But of course, now that we understand the Darwinian theory of evolution, that argument has fallen into disrepute. We understand much better how it is that we have certain organs, how it is that beings exist, that they have evolved over barely imaginable periods of time. Only those that were indeed adapted to their environment and could survive and reproduce left descendants that are still with us. And I think the fossil record now shows that, and more recently our understanding of genetics shows our own biological relationship with very simple organisms, including bacteria with whom we share some genes, and then progressively we share more genes with beings more like us until we get up to the great apes, chimpanzees, with whom we share something like 98% of our genes. So I think evolution is one of the most firmly established scientific theories with a huge amount of evidence for it, and we don't therefore need the argument from design to explain how the universe comes to be like it is. So the arguments for the existence of God seem to me to be not strong. Now, interestingly, in the Protestant tradition, those arguments fell into disrepute quite a long time ago, and so Protestants began to disavow the arguments and say, what really matters is faith. But what is faith? Faith is really just believing in something for which you have neither rational arguments nor good evidence. I know that John is a mathematician by training, so I'm sure he's familiar with the 19th century mathematician and philosopher William Clifford, who wrote a very nice essay about faith, using as an analogy a ship owner who was about to send to sea a ship full of immigrants. We can imagine they were coming to Australia, if you like, since many immigrants did set sail from England in the 19th century. for Australia. And as we know, of course, you only have to go down to the Great Ocean Road and you find many places where some of those ships foundered and sank with great loss of life, for example, around Loch Ard. But this ship owner that Clifford imagines is uncertain whether his ship is seaworthy enough to make the long voyage to bring the immigrants to the new land. But he thinks about it and he says, well, look, after all, there's a divine providence. And how could a divine providence allow these good people who are going to establish their futures, men, women and children even, who are, at least the children, innocent of any sin, how could he allow them to drown on the way to the new world? So I will have faith in God, and I won't bother to inspect the ship to see whether it's seaworthy, because I have faith that it will reach Australia. Well, of course, as I say, we know that some ships did not, and we would fault this ship owner and say, you can't just have faith in that way. You need to check the evidence. You need to look at it. The ship owner's faith would have put lives at risk, and unfortunately, in the real world today, faith also puts lives at risk. In fact, the refusal of the Roman Catholic Church to tolerate the use of condoms, even in regions of sub-Saharan Africa where the risk of contracting HIV/AIDS is extremely high, has undoubtedly not merely put lives at risk, but cost perhaps millions of innocent human lives. We pay a high price for the religious faith of some religious leaders. So, I don't think the arguments for God are good, and I don't think we should rely on faith to replace arguments. But I have two arguments against belief in the God of the Bible. The first argument is that although we may live in a society in which most religious believers are Christians, or, since we're talking about the God of the Bible, let's group together Christians and those of the Jewish faith, most religious believers come from one of those two religions, and if we want to broaden this to the Abrahamic traditions, we can include Muslims as well. We know, as a matter of sociological fact, that if they had been brought up in other cultures with different religious beliefs, let's say in India, they would have been much more likely to be Hindus. Or if they had been brought up in Islamic countries, the Christians and Jews would have been much more likely to be Muslims. So there's a kind of relativism about religious belief that should at least lead us to a sceptical attitude towards it. Is it just a coincidence that John is a Christian when his parents were Christians? It's surely not just a coincidence. It's surely that cultural tradition which made it easier for him to accept that belief. Although, of course, many Christians, children of many Christians do abandon their belief. But I think that should at least make us critical about those traditions. But the second negative argument seems to me much the stronger one. And this is that if we're talking about the God of the Judeo-Christian tradition, that God is standardly defined as a being who is all-knowing, all-powerful and all-good, omnipotent, omniscient and omnibenevolent. And yet there is suffering in the world. How could there be suffering in the world if there were a God who knew about this suffering, had the power to prevent it, and did not prevent it? Well, Christians, of course, are not ignorant of this counter-argument, and they say many things. For example, they say, but God gave us free will. That was a great gift, worth all the suffering that occurs. But given that we have free will, he could not stop us from causing each other to suffer. Well, we might question whether the gift of free will is worth the horrendous amount of suffering that there has been in the world from, no doubt, as long as there have been beings capable of suffering. But putting that aside, it's obvious that there is suffering in the world which is not caused by free will. For example, you will all know that For about a dozen years, ending only, perhaps was it a year or 18 months ago, southeastern Australia had a terrible drought. And during that drought, many animals died. They died simply because the water holes dried up, or they could not get enough to eat. It was not human action that caused that suffering. So there is suffering in the world which is not caused by humans, caused by earthquakes, droughts, and so on. Christians sometimes also say that suffering is the result of sin. But it's impossible to believe that a small child who is crushed by a falling building in an earthquake has sinned and therefore deserves that suffering. And of course, the animals that I've already mentioned did not sin, and yet they suffer, not only at human hands, but at the hands of nature. I have asked many intelligent, thoughtful Christians, and I'm asking John Lennox again tonight, to explain to me how the existence of undeserved suffering not caused by human activity could be compatible with the idea that an all-knowing God created this world, knows about the suffering, could have predicted the suffering at the time of the creation of the world, and did not change things to reduce this vast amount of suffering that goes on in the world today. It seems to me wildly implausible that this world is a world that was created by that kind of God. It seems to me much more likely that this is simply a world that has arisen through the processes of evolution that we are now increasingly familiar with, which are indeed blind and unguided, but have nevertheless thrown up beings capable of reasoning, and in response to what John said, I would say developed capacities to understand the world and their situation, because that did have survival advantages, but now can use these capacities to understand the world. That seems to me by far the more plausible picture of the world we're in than the one that theists attempt to persuade us to accept. Thank you. Suffering that there has been in the world from, no doubt, as long as there have been beings capable of suffering. But putting that aside, it's obvious that there is suffering in the world which is not caused by free will. For example, you will all know that for about a dozen years, ending only, perhaps was it a year or 18 months ago, southeastern Australia had a terrible drought. And during that drought, many animals died. They died simply because the water holes dried up, or they could not get enough to eat. It was not human action that caused that suffering. So there is suffering in the world which is not caused by humans, caused by earthquakes, droughts, and so on. Christians sometimes also say that suffering is the result of sin. But it's impossible to believe that a small child who is crushed by a falling building in an earthquake has sinned and therefore deserves that suffering. And of course, the animals that I've already mentioned did not sin, and yet they suffer, not only at human hands, but at the hands of nature. I have asked many intelligent, thoughtful Christians, and I'm asking John Lennox again tonight, to explain to me how the existence of undeserved suffering not caused by human activity could be compatible with the idea that an all-knowing God created this world, knows about the suffering, could have predicted the suffering at the time of the creation of the world, and did not change things to reduce this vast amount of suffering that goes on in the world today. It seems to me wildly implausible that this world is a world that was created by that kind of God. It seems to me much more likely that this is simply a world that has arisen through the processes of evolution that we are now increasingly familiar with, which are indeed blind and unguided, but have nevertheless thrown up beings capable of reasoning, and in response to what John said, I would say developed capacities to understand the world and their situation, because that did have survival advantages, but now can use these capacities to understand the world. That seems to me by far the more plausible picture of the world we're in than the one that theists attempt to persuade us to accept. Thank you.